So we've talked about a lot so far, and if you're getting just some of this, you're doing great. Keep in mind it takes real recording engineers hours and hours of education, hours of studio time to really, get this sort of information ingrained. But my hope is that you'll have some of this information to move forward, and over time you'll develop more and more of it. Of course, our online programs really give you a lot more time as we discuss these things, a lot more demonstration, and it certainly is going to be a lot more comprehensible. But if you've retained some of what we talked about, you're doing great. So now I'm going to move to a different topic. This is called signal processing. Signal processing means affecting the signal. Now, we've talked about equalization. The filters, the high, mid-range, treble, that's equalization essentially. And that is signal processing. But there's another type of signal processing I want to talk about. I want to talk about the term compressor limiter. If you open up your software, some of your inserts are going to be compressor limiters. And you may even see various brands or types of compressor limiters. Compressor limiter is essentially a leveling amplifier, and what it's designed to do, what its purpose is to keep the level going to the recording somewhat consistent. Some singers will sing very, very loud and very, very soft in the same song. So in order to keep that level more consistent going to the recording, you want to apply a compressor or a limiter. The difference between a compressor and a limiter is the amount of reduction or the amount of control it places on that volume. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but essentially a compressor limiter is the same thing. One byproduct, though, or one thing that happens when you send your signal, your vocal or your guitar through a compressor limiter, is it not only levels the sound, but it tends to sonically shape it. In addition to that, there are so many different types of compressor limiters and so many different kinds that depending on which kind you select, it also sonically shapes the sound. So although a compressor limiter is really designed to just level the playing field or level the volume going to your recording and keep it more consistent, a byproduct of that is the musical component of sonically shaping your sound. You can get a bass guitar to sound fatter, you can get a vocal to sound more pristine, you could actually get an acoustic guitar to sound more intimate and closer to your ears by using compressor limiters. I want to bring you over to our rack over here, and you'll see in this professional recording studio we have many compressor limiters to choose from. We have these nice big looking Teletronics LA2As, and they have the meter in the middle and they have a few controls on them. Now these are tube style compressor limiters, and what I mean by that is they're actually driven by tubes like your old tube TV was. So the tubes in here though give it a very distinct sound or warmth. So when I put a signal through one of these limiters, it tends to get very warm and even sound fatter or bigger. So I may use this in a musical way. Another limiter we have here is the Teletronics Universal Audio 1176. Now these are transistor type limiter compressors, but again these are also very, very common in a professional environment. Now the reason why I pointed out these two limiters were this is a very widely used professional transistor type limiter compressor, and this is a very widely used professional tube type limiter compressor. When you go to your local retail store and you look for plugins, you may find these exact 1176 model plugins for your computer at a very affordable price. As well, you may find these LA2As for your computer. As well, you may find these Neve 33609s for your computer. The names I'm saying really don't mean anything, but if you have an opportunity to buy a compressor limiter, you'll discover through use that this provides a certain effect on your sound. So if you're mixing a record or recording a record and you want to get a certain result from the bass guitar or from the vocal that you didn't have before, you may want to try a limiter, not really for its design purpose of leveling the sound, although that's part of it. Really, as recording engineers in professional studios, for years we've been using limiter compressors to musically shape the sound, to provide a sonic quality, if you will, to the sound that wasn't there before, and thus making it more representative of what we want to hear. So we actually use these in a very creative fashion. So thinking, acting, and performing like a real recording engineer in your home studio, you may want to use these limiter compressors to sonically shape a sound as well as leveling out the volume going to your recording. In a little while I'm going to demonstrate the guitar going through each one of these limiter compressors so you can hear sort of the difference that each one of them make on a singular sound. And it really makes a big difference in the final result of your recording. Great. Well, let's listen to how that compressor can sonically shape our guitar sound. It'll level the signal off, but also it'll provide some sonic or musical quality to the sound. What we'll do is we'll listen to it without it, and then we'll listen to it with it. The first thing we'll have to do is determine how to actually get that compressor in line with the microphone of the guitar amp, right? Well, we do what's called an inline patch. An inline patch is, well, similar to what we mean when we say inline console, is that the inline patch means the compressor goes in line with the signal. And it really affects the entire signal, or the entire microphone sound, if you will. On this particular recording console, we have what's called an insert point. The insert point allows us to take a wire and go to the compressor, and then take a wire from the compressor and go back into the insert point in the input channel. In your computer, you're going to have a similar way of inserting the compressor limiter in the signal flow, but you won't necessarily have to take a wire to do it. In this case, we've taken a wire and we've used the patch bay here in the analog domain, which is part of the recording console. And again, the patch point gives us an opportunity to take a wire and go to that compressor, and then take a wire from that compressor and go back to the channel. And I have the opportunity now to engage that insert, or turn it on, if you will, with the flick of a switch. So I'll be able to audition for you the sound without the compressor, and then very simply put the switch in, and then we'll hear the compressor in the sound. Play, please. All right, so we're getting ready to track a song, and here's the sound without the compressor. And now I'm going to put the compressor in. Has a whole other personality, right? Here's it without it. And again, in, right? Now, you may notice that the sound got more exciting, got fuller, a little bit warmer. Some of the high end, or the trebly tone that was there before, seems to be a little smoother now. I've used the LA2A, the tube compressor. You may want to write that down in your workbook. You can go out to your retailer and actually buy a plug-in that represents, or has algorithms, I should say, that digitally represents what we've done here in the analog domain. But it really has a lot of personality to the sound. Let's listen one more time. That's without and with. You notice that some of the lower strings start to speak a little louder now, right? So it may be more of a subtle difference, but as this gets recorded with other instruments and we start mixing our song, in and of themselves, all of the particular sounds get affected one way or another, and these subtle differences add up to a very powerful difference in your end result and your final product. Okay, great. Well, just for comparison, I'm now plugged in the other type of compressor, the 1176, made by Universal Audio. Again, if you care to, you may want to note this particular model. You can go get this plug-in if you like. I always recommend that you have several compressors in your tool kit, or in your computer system, or if you're dealing in the analog domain, certainly have a few compressors you could work with in outboard gear. And this gives you really a lot of versatility to providing more sonic quality or musicality to your sound overall. So now let's listen to the difference from the guitar without any compressor and now the other 1176, and you may hear a subtle difference that you didn't hear before with the tube amplifier. And again, the tube amplifier, the tube compressor, is going to give you a difference that you won't hear now. So let's audition. Play, please. Okay, now I'm going to put it in. Again, out. And in. So this one is still transparent. In other words, the sound hasn't changed as drastically as it did with the tube compressor, right? With the tube compressor, we may have noticed a larger change than we do now. Essentially, we hear the sound sort of coming together, getting a little bit more tight, if you will, and certainly getting more in our face, right? And it's really just sounding more cohesive, but there's that subtle difference again by using the compressor. Again, out. Again, some of that high end seems to be a little bit annoying, so the compressor rounds that out somewhat. But again, the tube compressor adds a little more warmth that we may or may not want. So now I'm going to go back to the tube compressor one more time, and you'll hear the difference there. Could I have that patch, please? Yes. And here's the tube compressor. So again, a subtle difference, but to me, this feels more exciting. So if I was recording this guitar for this type of music and this type of information, thank you. If I was recording this guitar for this type of song or this type of information, I'd probably be likely to use the tube-driven compressor and get that nice, exciting warmth, and somehow that has a different feeling to it when I listen with that. Now, when you go home to experiment with some of your music, this is a very important part of the recording engineering process. This is really thinking, acting, and performing like a real recording engineer. So keep in mind, there's no rules here, there's just a lot of options. It's your job to discover those options, but use them in a musical way, and you'll be very happy you did. Okay, well, we've talked about compressor limiters and equalizers. We've talked about how to patch them in the signal path in line. Right now I'm going to talk about a different type of processor. It's called time-based processor. Now, in your recording software, you certainly have some options or plugins or inserts that talk about adding a reverb or a delay or maybe a flange sound. These are called time-based processors. Now, a delay is nothing more than having a sound reflect off a wall far away. A reverb is a lot of those delays, what we call random reflections. It's produced when a sound occurs in a larger space with a lot of reflective walls or floors. We have sort of a lot of bouncing of the sound going around, and when you hear that in that room, it appears as though the sound's occurring in a big room. And then we have flanging, which is essentially adding another component to the sound. The sound actually repeats itself in a sort of different way. And we're going to hear what that is in a moment. Let's talk about delays and reverbs. Why would we use them, right? Well, we'll talk about reverbs for a moment. If we wanted the player or the performance or the sound to sound like it was in a larger room than it was really in, we would add reverb to emulate a larger space, right? And the delay would also position that player further away. So let's say, for example, you wanted your sound to appear as though it took place in a concert hall, and you wanted the listener to perceive that sound as being seated in sort of the rear row of the concert hall. You would have the performance go through a delay and then a reverb. So where it appears as though the performance is further away and that the reverb gives you that image of a large concert hall. Before we listen to that, we have to talk about how we patch that in the signal flow. Other than the compressor limiter, we want to patch it in a different way. We call this a sidechain patch. And I'm going to demonstrate in a moment how that looks, but let's review our signal path that we've been learning about. The guitar microphone comes in the input section of the input channel. It goes through the filters, the equalizer. We bypass the auxiliary sends essentially on the input channel. We go to the volume controller fader. Goes out of the bus into track 1 of the Pro Tools recorder. It comes back through this channel, through the tape input, goes through the filters, the equalization here. Again, I could use all that if I want to shape the sound. But I'm going to refer to the auxiliary sends here in the playback channel. Now, remember before we used the auxiliary send or the Q send, and we used it in a pre-fader fashion, right? So that it sent the signal to the headphones of the guitar player. And regardless of what we did here with this volume control, it didn't change the level of that particular send to the headphones. Well, we're going to use an auxiliary send to send some of this guitar signal and sort of split it in the road to go to one of our electronic devices that produces delays, reverbs, or flanging. Only this time, instead of using it in a pre-fader position, we're going to use it in a post-fader position, and here's the reason why. If we say we're going to assign a certain amount of level of this particular sound to go, let's say, for example, out of auxiliary 1 to the reverb, and we decide to change the level of the particular dry sound in our mix, we want that level to also change in what's going out to the reverb. So as we listen to the dry guitar sound and the reverb, it's going